Maryland has a long and fascinating history, especially because it was one of the first places where settlements began as Europeans began immigrating over to what they called the New World. Agriculture, or planting and harvesting crops, was the largest profession for the new settlers to the land. Marylanders typically grew things like corn and tobacco. In order to grow these crops, however, the landowners needed a lot of people to help work in their fields. The largest source of labor at first were indentured servants. Indentured servants were people who signed a contract agreeing to work for a certain number of years in exchange for transportation from Europe to the Americas, as well as food and shelter once they arrived. Some landowners, however, also had slaves. In the early 1600s, indentured servants were more popular than African slaves, and many Europeans, especially Irish, came over to be indentured servants. In the late 1600s, the economy was improving in Europe, and it was more difficult for landowners to get indentured servants to come and work in Maryland. Many indentured servants were also ending their contracts and beginning to own their own land. That meant that there were less indentured servants and even more landowners who needed labor in their fields. Farmers began to discover that owning a slave for their whole life was much cheaper in the long run than keeping indentured peoples whom they had to care for and then eventually release from their contracts. As slavery became more popular, laws were put into place to help govern the use of slaves. Two different laws were passed in 1663 and 1664, which sanctioned lifelong slavery and made African people and their children property. In 1658, there were only around 100 slaves in Charles, Calvert, and St. Mary's County, but by 1708, a quarter of the population consisted of slaves, around 3,500. Slaves were completely dependent on their masters for basic necessities like food, water, and shelter. They often had to work very long days in extreme conditions and could be punished severely for not performing as the masters wanted them to. Since slavery conditions were so inhumane, some slaves would make an attempt at running away. One of the most famous Marylanders to escape slavery successfully was Harriet Tubman. Even though she could have been tortured and killed if she was caught, she persisted and created what is known as the Underground Railroad. Later, some slaves would join the Union Army in the Civil War in order to serve as free men. Congress freed slaves in Washington, D.C. in 1862, but Maryland did not free slaves until 1864, and it barely passed. After it passed, slaves were declared free, but the state was very slow in enacting any change. Maryland was divided in the Civil War, which caused many conflicts between those who were for and those who were against slavery. Much of Maryland was pro-slavery during the Civil War, making abolition a slow and difficult process.
Most of southern Maryland was still rural in the 1950s, and fishing and agriculture, especially tobacco farming, were vital to the economy as they had been for over 300 years. For 2 centuries, from the mid-1600s to the mid-1800s, the tobacco economy relied on slave labor. Southern sympathies ran deep, and the Civil War, which people in some areas of St. Mary's County still refer to as the War of the Northern Invasion, created deep enmities in the county. Bitter wounds not healed by the 1950s and divides not bridged even today.
St. Mary's County was one of the last counties to desegregate public schools. Even though Brown versus the Board of Education was passed in 1954, mandating that all public schools needed to desegregate. However, St. Mary's County schools didn't desegregate until 1967, over a decade later. In St. Mary's County, we can still see some of the remnants of segregation. The building, which was once Carver High School, which was an all-black high school, still stands in St. Mary's County, although the building has been reconverted to house other community services. In both Ridge and Scotland, you can still see the buildings which were once one-room schoolhouses for African American children to attend school. Schools in Maryland are no longer legally segregated. However, Segregation is a very recent part of Maryland's history, which is important for us to remember and to learn about.